I want to thank you all for attending this very powerful breakout session about healing, restoring, and forgiving communities in an incarcerated nation. I wish I didn't have to use that word. My name is Maxine Richmond, and I'm a member of the JCPA Board of Directors. Before we begin, one thing. Please remember to silence your cell phones, and if you're tweeting or Facebooking about this session, please use the conference hashtag JCPA 2018. So JCPA has prioritized the issue of criminal justice reform as a very important one for the Jewish community relations field. And we have launched a comprehensive criminal justice reform project that we hope you will consider implementing when you go back to your home. This session is entitled Healing, Restoring, and Forgiving Communities in an Incarcerated Nation. It will examine and discuss how to rebuild community connections through collective healing, forgiveness, and rehabilitation in an age of mass incarceration. Experts will guide participants in how to effectively build this approach into local programming through social and emotional learning to help disrupt the cycle of incarceration and trauma. We have a wonderful panel today that was organized by JCPA's new Criminal Justice Project Manager, Roy Waterman, and welcome Roy, who will be moderating this panel. The panel includes some incredible people who are doing exceptional work around empowering, employing, and healing people who have been intercepted by the criminal justice system. It is my pleasure today to introduce Jordyn Lexton, the founder and executive director of Drive Change, which provides people returning home from jail and prison the opportunity to cultivate their genius through workplace learning. And Andre Ward, Director of Programs at Criminal Justice, at Common Justice, which develops and advances solutions to violence that transforms the lives of those harmed and fosters racial equity without relying on incarceration. You can read their full bios in the conference app, and now it's my pleasure to turn this workshop over to Roy.
Thank you, Maxine. Appreciate it. Hello. How's everyone? Okay. So hopefully you were charged and energized from your last panel. And I want you to know you're in for a treat. You're in for some education. You're in for some incredible storytelling, as well as you're in for opportunity to remove any prejudice or stigmas you might already have about people who have been intercepted by the criminal justice system and what is the criminal justice system. I like to use criminal injustice system a lot of times, but it kind of sounds weird. But I'm big on language. So a little bit about me. I'm Roy Waterman. I'm a baby. I'm 2 months old. That means 2 months in JCPA. That has a beard and a deep voice. And it's nice to meet you all. And my role is to engage and educate the Jewish community about criminal justice reform, mass incarceration, and as well as how do we bridge the gap between the Jewish community and communities of color? How do we work together? So what that means is it's not about the Jewish community building and creating programs. It's about the Jewish community coming alongside to support and to partner with organizations that are doing the work on the grassroots level, on the ground, every day. So we have to realize that none of us are free until all of us are free. So this problem of mass incarceration, as I like to often say, is a system that is not broken, is working perfectly fine. And the reason why I say that is because it's working perfectly fine for the men who created it. And this system and this country is built over institutional racism, and that's what the system is. It's modern day slavery, and it's the Jewish community's engagement with the modern day civil rights movement. So I'm going to pass this over to my two fellow panelists up here who are doing incredible work. I want them to spend a couple minutes talking about themselves, a little bit about the work they're doing, and then I want to get to Q&A with you.
All right, I'm going to go first. I went first last time too. I thought Andre was going to switch it up on me. Hi everybody, my name is Jordyn Lexton. I want to tell you a little bit just about myself and my entry point into some of this work as well. But before I do that, I also want to thank Roy for having me on this panel. Roy didn't mention this, but he's actually the co-founder of Drive Change, the organization that I now run. So we have a long-standing history together, and it's just really incredible for me also that Roy is now in this role. You have such an incredible resource. So please tap into Roy as you think about ways to get more involved in mass incarceration and criminal justice. So I grew up pretty close to here. I grew up on 81st and Lexington. Are there any other New Yorkers in this house? All right, yeah. Well, it's also wonderful that people are coming from all over the country to be here today. So I grew up on 81st and Lexington, and I went to a private high school and school in New York City. It's called the Dalton School. It's a really privileged environment. I grew up with, when I went there from age 5 to 18. So thinking about just as a 16, 17-year-old in high school, what my future was going to look like. I had really, the world was really open to me. What could I be? What could I do? And I also, when you live on 81st in Lexington, you could like walk outside and fall into a networking opportunity. It's really quite an incredible privilege. I'm also Jewish. My Jewish identity and community and faith has been a central part of culturally who I am. And when I was thinking about, I was in 2004, I graduated from high school, I went to college, and from there I was thinking about what do I want to do with my life, and my mom's a teacher. And education has always been a really central part of our family, our community, but the way that I thought about it, education is a little different. I believe very much in alternative education. I don't think that every person learns their best in a classroom setting. I think I'm an athlete, and for me, some of my most teachable moments were on the field. So I pursued a job after college teaching inside of the public high school on Rikers Island. Rikers Island is a jail complex that's about 1.5 miles from here, right next to LaGuardia Airport. So for those of you who flew in from out of state into LaGuardia, you likely flew right over Rikers Island. It is a jail complex that houses, at this point, about 9,000 people at any given time, around 77,000 New Yorkers and neighbors. And there is a public high school on Rikers Island because New York remains one of only 2 states that automatically treats 16-year-olds like adults in the criminal justice system. So let's sit with that for a second. 16-year-olds who are arrested, about 50,000 or so per year in New York State, are processed in criminal court, not juvenile court. If and when they spend any time in jail, it's at Rikers Island, not a juvenile facility. And I'm a New Yorker, I'm proud of being a New Yorker, but it's just not acceptable to me. When I was teaching inside of Rikers, I witnessed one of the only places where people were happy was inside of a culinary arts class. It was one of the places where people were treated like real humans. Otherwise, it is an incredibly violent, incredibly dehumanizing, structurally classist and racist place where the population of young adults I was working with who had the same sort of visions of what they wanted their future to look like as I did growing up in New York City, but their road ahead was really blocked and restricted by way of being a young teenager who has already been intercepted by the criminal justice system. But this culinary arts class was a place where people were thriving. So I thought about the fact that I think more New Yorkers want to get involved in these issues around class, economic, and race and justice, and don't necessarily have access to the information. and that all the young people I worked with wanted these bright futures and didn't have access to the opportunity. So with Roy's help, we started a food truck business as a platform for running a paid fellowship for young adults coming home from jail. And that fellowship, that 12-month fellowship, we use our food truck to both teach the skills of culinary arts, but really the social and emotional skills. Communication, conflict resolution, problem solving, time management, diligence, grit. It's a platform for really investing in those skills. And by being mobile, we got to get out in the community and really raise awareness about injustice inside of the criminal justice system. So I'm really thrilled to be here, to be alongside Roy and Andre, who has been a partner in an ally in this work for years as well. Thank you so much for having me.
How's everybody feeling? Partly cloudy, chance of showers, or sunny? Which one? Sunny. Sunny, good. And so my name is Andre Ward, and I serve as the Director of Programs at an organization called Common Justice. Common Justice serves as the first and only alternative to incarceration victim services program in the United States that focuses on violence, focuses on racial justice, but also focuses on healing in different ways. And so we do our work based on restorative justice principles. And so when you think about our restorative justice work, for our folk from our Jewish community, you think of the term teshuva, that has all to do with this idea of repentance and atoning for one's sin. So our work is kind of connected in that way, where we look to bring people together. In one instance, the person who's been harmed by crime and the person that's responsible for causing it, we bring those people together in a way to really produce real justice. And so we know that our current criminal punishment system, or injustice system as some refer to too, is fundamentally and fatally flawed. And so this more retributive and punitive side of the work of criminal justice does not really get at people healing in some way. So common justice takes a look at working to heal people, even though harm has been caused, healing people by understanding that one, people have the capacity to change and transform their lives, but the other thing, people deserve to be able to face the person that harmed them in a way that they can receive true justice. And so common justice does that kind of work. Unlike Jordyn, I didn't grow up on 81st Street on the east side. Unlike Jordyn, I didn't go to Dalton. But I grew up in the Eastern New York section of Brooklyn. I was raised there by my mom since I was 2 years old. And so my mom raised me much like any other mom, right? She was really strict. I thought she was a tyrant at one point, right? But it was cool, right? Because she instilled in some principles in me that will follow me all the way up to this day that I'm before you. I currently teach as an adjunct professor at a college, Greg Evans College in Brooklyn. I teach social work, introduction to social work. I'm a social worker by profession. I worked at an organization called the Osborne Association for those from New York City. It's one of the leading reentry program organizations in the country. I served as Director of Workforce Development there for several years. I am the co-host and associate producer of a radio program called On the Count, the Prison and Criminal Justice Report, that comes on WBAI 99.5 FM. That's not a plug, I'm just mentioning it. And I'm saying all that in context because although I've done all those things, I still do it. I serve a couple of board of directors, organizations. I also served 16 years of my life in prison, right? And obviously you look now like, oh, wow, it's different, right? And that's intentional, right? That I shared all of these things that I've done, not to arrogate to myself importance, but to suggest that you're dealing with human beings, right, who've had criminal justice involvement, that have demonstrated their capacity to change, and by extension are now giving back. They're now impacting the criminal justice system in a way that we're informing the discussion because now we're in leadership. So I'm going to stop there because we really want to hear from you in terms of your questions so we can be of some resource to you. But I just want to share, that's the work that I do currently with Common Justice. Our executive director is Danielle Sarrett. She's also Jewish. She's a really powerful person, a really strong working partner with me and obviously my supervisor, but she's just a brilliant human being who's committed to social justice work, and by extension, it's really changing the criminal justice system by offering an alternative to incarceration by addressing people in a way that heals them.
Wait. The questions are coming. I'm gonna ask them like at least one question first, and then we'll open it up. There'll be a lot of Q&A, so we'll open it up. I also forgot to mention this as well. You know, I am a chef as well. I forgot to mention this. I'm a chef and I have a catering business. Besides co-founding Drive Change, also paralegal, also a formerly incarcerated man that spent almost 13 years in prison. As I often like to say, you can never judge a book by its cover, one. That's the first part. And the second part is, I am not my worst mistake, I am not my worst decision. So I'm big on language, and I'm big on how language is used when you're describing or talking about people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system or intercepted. Notice the terms I'm using: intercepted, justice system. You didn't hear me use inmate, you didn't hear me use prisoner, you didn't hear me use monster, animal. We have to use humanizing language when we're describing people who have broken the norms of society. Always keep in mind, there's one thing we are all capable of doing, and that is, or one thing we're responsible, I should say. Well, there are two things. What we do, one, and two is what we say out of our mouths. So we can control what we say out of our mouths. So I'm calling you to action, or calling you to action to hold yourself accountable for the language you're using when you're describing people who break any sorts of norms in society. Think people first language, right? So a person that committed a robbery, people who did a burglary, people who murdered somebody, a person that killed somebody, like a person that's in prison, or one person who left prison, a formerly incarcerated person, formerly incarcerated people. Let's keep people first language, humanizing language, and it brings for us dignity as well. We were told a long time ago, that old nursery school rhyme, that sticks and stones will break our bones and words will never hurt us. That was a lie. We realized in our older years that words have a lasting impact on us. Look at now, and I'll give you a quick example. We're living in 2018 where we now have what you call an opioid addiction. And 35 years ago, it was called the war on drugs, the crack era, where people of color were criminalized and arrested at disproportionate rates and just thrown away and discarded because they used drugs. Never mind they sold it, they used the drug and it was looked at as a crime. So now we fast forward and here we are saying now kids are able to use drugs and now it's a public health crisis. Now, I'm one that's big on saying that all these systems of oppression are built on institutional racism, and I believe personally that the reason why it's looked at as a public health crisis is because it's impacting Sarah, Jane, Billy, Bobby, who lives in middle America most of the time. So now it's looked at much differently than Tyrone, Shaniqua, Shaquana, who lives in the projects of Brownsville or Howard Houses or East New York. Like, we have to keep in context that the system that's built is not broken, and it was built by white men who were in power, and it was built to oppress, and it's done that well for a very long time. So really quickly, I want to say to you guys, why should this be an issue when it comes to healing and restoring? Identify the relation between mass incarceration and slavery and the Jewish community and the Holocaust when it comes to trauma, therapy, and restoring. Okay. I'll condense it. Identify to me, or find the correlation between mass incarceration and slavery, because mass incarceration to me is the modern day slavery, it just has manifested. So slavery and mass incarceration with the residual impacts of the Jewish community when it comes to the Holocaust.
First again? So one of the questions that we've now had, this is the second time we've done this panel, so Roy has been able to ask these questions twice, and we've been able to think about them twice also too, which is an interesting process. But So part of this question really connects to like, what is it about Jews, Jewish people, that specifically, like, where is there a lens or a lane that is connected to the experience of mass incarceration, an experience that is overwhelmingly impacting poorer communities of color. I shared last session and this one again that when I was a teacher inside of the public high school in Rikers, every year I would teach two books, more than two, but the same two would always come up. And those were A Raisin in the Sun and Elie Wiesel's Night. And in teaching Night, working with 16 and 17-year-old, mostly Black and Latino young boys, the connections and themes that they would draw on the experience of the biography of Elie Wiesel and his father it was incredible, just the way that when thinking about the impacts of oppression and trauma and how that traced for us in our conversations, it was a very, very direct conversation and a direct connection. It was also through some of just the readings that I had done myself in college and kind of also while I was teaching around not just Night and Elie Wiesel, although some of the Elie Wiesel works about being a witness and what is our responsibility as witnesses when it comes to injustice resonates very deeply for me personally. And I think as a Jewish person and thinking about my experience as a witness, the idea that when you become aware of something, you then have an active choice to make. Now that you're aware of these injustices, what is the act? What are the things you're going to do to try to make our society be a more just one? And also some of the reading I'd done in college around the Holocaust, and in particular around ideas of just the banality of evil. So, the notion and the reality that one's environmental conditions affects one's behavior. When you think about survivors in the Holocaust or people living through the Holocaust, the kind of things that people had to do just to survive did not come from an innate part of themselves. It came from a response to what those dehumanizing conditions truly were like. And my experience teaching on Rikers Island for 3 years is that these same kinds of dehumanizing conditions are happening in modern day slavery in the form of mass incarceration in our country. And so when you think about, what is the role of Judaism in terms of thinking through forgiveness or also thinking through repentance and all of that, I think that there's an element and a real conversation to be had on that side. But what connects for me more is going back to thinking about that banality of evil and how when environmental conditions are such, we behave in ways that would be different if the environmental conditions were other. So that's the real connection that I think about every single day. And when I was working with my students, I thought often that if I were in their shoes, I don't know that I would be able to be as well behaved. So that's, for me, how I'll answer that question.
And I think consistent with what Jordyn said, that's why I like Jordyn to speak first. But consistent with what she's saying, I think this idea of humanity, right? Understanding the suffering of others is like super critical. We don't lift up the 65 years or so or more of the Holocaust being more or better than the 300 plus years of slavery of someone of African descent, right? The commonality is the suffering that people experienced, right? The pain that they experienced, the ability to endure through that and then to develop ways in which to cope in that experience. And so when you look at trauma, obviously through that lens, especially as a social worker, right, we realize that this idea of traumatic experiences is something that people can identify with too. But people respond to trauma differently. And so I think the relationship between the Jewish community and obviously folk who had this whole idea of being incarcerated is important because we can unify around like changing the system in and of itself. I think one of the greater challenges happen among not just folks from the Jewish community, not just even internally within the criminal justice reform world, is that people find it hard to unify in action together. And so I think it's important that we have to develop a unity of action without feeling that we would compromise in some way our religious, our organizational, or other identities in some way. And I think that's been hugely problematic in terms of movement building. That in some way, if I get involved with, attach myself to, become partners with, that in some way it's going to compromise my identity in some way. And so when we're talking about this larger, broader band initiative of criminal justice reform, it's important to realize that no one's identity has to be compromised, but the very things that fundamentally bring us together in terms of our understanding suffering and our understanding how people can triumph through that suffering if they work together collectively, I think is important for us to all work together in that way.
Thank you. I'm about to open up for questions. I want to say one last thing, and that is a couple of statistics you should know, and that is there's 70 million Americans that are walking around right now with a criminal record. 70 million. There are roughly around 450,000 people who are being released every day from jails and prisons. There, 1 out of every 3 black men has a record. 1 out of every 6 Latino men have a record. Women are the fastest growing demographic of incarceration. Over the last 30 years, it's grown over 800%. So these are some numbers you need to digest. Right now in New York, you're in New York, and Jordyn mentioned LaGuardia and mentioned Rikers Island. Might not know about Rikers Island. Rikers Island is the largest holding jail in the country. In the heart, or I would say in its glory years in 1990, 1991, Rikers Island housed about 22,000 people. 22,000 people where over 80% of them have not, 89% of them have not been sentenced to anything. There, as Brian Stevens says, it's better to be rich, white, and guilty than it is to be poor, black, and innocent. And as Martin Luther King says, a threat to injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So with that said, we'll open up for questions. Yes, Stanley.
So this is something you and I have talked a lot about, but I think our larger audience could really benefit from hearing it directly from you. And you alluded to it earlier, but how exactly is slavery like mass incarceration today? What is the connection between the two, and how do we see it in policy and sort of the legal issues within mass incarceration that make it so similar, and some could argue pretty much exactly the same as slavery?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. Even the very language that was used in slavery at some point in time, right? They used language like contraband, which is the same language they used as when you're incarcerated. If you possess something that you're not supposed to have, right, they consider that contraband. The very idea of how they search people in jail is the same way that they search slaves, right? So they have you take off all your clothing and articles, they run your thumbs through your fingers through your mouth, and all those kind of things. The other policies around, at the time they called them vagrancy laws, right? Where you couldn't be out at a certain time. And then they had these laws where, if you were with a certain amount of people at one time in a group, right, you were like arrested, right? And so in prison it's the same thing. You can only be with like 6 people to a group inside. At each checkpoint you go somewhere, you have to show a pass to get to a certain place. Same thing in slavery, right? If you were enslaved at the time, you had to show passes to get from point A to point B. And so all those things are connected in different ways as it relates to some of the practices in slavery and some of the same practices that exist in prisons that's been made policy in different ways. And so it's really important to understand that relationship, right? Because we know that if those things existed then and they existed now, right, there's not going to be any change unless we begin to change it by informing the conversation about what needs to be changed. So that's just some kind of like basic relationship between how things existed in slavery, right, and some of what exists in prison more specifically.
Good question, and I'll quickly answer as well. And I'll answer by saying that as during slavery, you know, you had slave names, right? People were given names, right? And I'm gonna do a lot of parallels and comparisons. Not a lot, but just a couple. When you go into state prison or federal prison, you're given a number. Your name is removed from you. So you're known as, I've been known as 99A6054, which is my state number, and my federal number was 353-98083. Because I spend time in state and federal custody. So it's all about, when I remove your name, I can remove your dignity. But then it makes it easier for me to then, if I remove your name, I can discard you. And there's no human connection or emotion there. But now, if you look at me as Roy the husband, Roy the son, Roy the brother, Roy the uncle, it makes it so much harder for you to want to do something to Roy. So it's and this is just like something that's simple and basic, this surface level stuff to compare to how how we are classified and how our dignity is removed, but also how we are objectified. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a very basic question, but it's a solution question. How do you, I live in a small community. I don't live in New York City. How do we find partners? We've been looking for partners and we can't seem, the collection we have are not the right partners because they don't really want to be in criminal justice. They want to be somewhere else. How do you find a partner in a smaller community, or anywhere for that matter?
And what community is that, if you don't mind?
Springfield, Illinois.
Oh, yeah, Illinois.
Homer Abraham Lincoln and the race riots and still segregated.
I think it's important that, especially for the people who have been impacted by the criminal justice themselves, to inform a discussion, right, and partner with, right? Historically, those who have been incarcerated have been excluded from the decision and discussion processes as it relates to what impacts their life. And so while we are very grateful for all of our partners and allies who support our work and join with us, our main goal is to allow us to lead, right? And we can inform this discussion.
I agree.
No, I'm not even saying that you don't. I'm just saying in terms
but I
of
agree,
partners.
but how do you go, where is there an address, I don't want to say an address, I guess it's a silly question.
There is no one-stop shop to find people
I'll
who are
take
just as
3
impacted.
stops.
But no, we're going to talk, and I'm going to assist you in that area, and know that there are people that are around that are doing the work, but because they lack the funding, because they lack the support, they're not out there, so you're not aware of them. And as Andre just mentioned, it's very important to partner with organizations that are led by people who are just as impacted. For a very long time, there were people who did not look like me, who would tell me what was best for me when I came home, despite the fact that they don't know what it's like to be black in America. So keep people who are just as impacted involved in the conversation.
I mean, one idea is just also to go to like local universities and have students who have extra time on their hands to do research, to find out what the organizations are in your very, very local neighborhood.
Good idea.
Yes.
What?
Hi, Roy. I'm Jessica. I'm the CRC director in Cleveland. Good to
Hello,
meet you in
nice
person.
to no longer virtually meet you.
That's right. So my question is following up on what you just said, and I think what Jordyn, Andre, and you are all alluding to is there's oftentimes in this work between the Jewish community and the African American and Latino community, there's a wide, vast chasm of privilege, like in between. Mm-hmm. And we as like CRC directors and lay leadership, like we run the risk of either being accidentally paternalistic or not wanting genuinely to engage the right way, but accidentally saying or doing the wrong thing. And then also just by mere status of being, either backed by a federation or the structure of a Jewish community. So my question to you is, from all your angles, like how do we as a field, like come at that in a way that's effective, but also like real for everyone, and not kind of sweeping it under the rug and just getting to the work.
So, this is why I was hired.
You bet.
So, as the connector,
That's a great question.
as the connector of this, I don't know how many, by the show of hands, how many of you have actually read the toolkit that JCPA put out? Just a show of hands.
Right.
Okay, that's not a lot. You should be ashamed of yourself. I see a lot of you looking down like I know I didn't read it. So, look at me as the living, breathing vessel of the toolkit. We put together that toolkit to break down a lot of different ways on how we can address this issue. So to speak to you specifically, Jessica, what you were talking about is like, for me, my role is to like educate first, right? And then mobilization, what that looks like is not reinventing the wheel. How do we partner with organizations on a grassroots level that are already doing the work? How do we use the natural resources of the JCRCs and then say, oh, we offer this? I'm a firm believer that you don't come into a situation or partnership empty-handed. You have to bring something to the table, right? So for me, if your JCRC has attorneys, whether currently practicing or retired, how do we partner with communities of color that can use pro bono work? How do we take businessmen or entrepreneurs that are part of our JCRC to then bring them into communities of color and do instructional classes about entrepreneurship? It's all about tapping into whatever your JCRC already offers and then saying, all right, how could we offer this externally, right? And then it's also about taking the lead, so that means you have to ask a lot of questions. It's not about you providing a source or coming to take over, because that's always going to cause a problem with communities of color. You have to always be in a position where it's like, okay, we're here to partner with you. Let us know what you need, how we can help. Not, this is what we have, this is what we're going to give you. That's the wrong type of language. That's the wrong type of conversation to have. You should be coming at this in a place of, listen, we respect you. We understand what it's like to be marginalized. We understand what it's like to be segregated as a Jewish community in this country. And what we're saying to you is that we identify you, we see you, and we want to partner with you, and we love you. So maybe that answered your question. I don't know.
One thing I'll add to that also too is just I think that so as a white person who is running an organization that's affecting mostly young people of color, I have to ask myself this question a lot, all the time. And I think that one thing is that you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Like the degree of institutionalized racism makes everyone racially biased. So I would say that there are really incredible organizations that are working on hacking racial bias. A friend, there's an organization called Be More America that a friend of mine, Anu Gupta, he's a lawyer and he does this hacking racial bias training inside of lots of different sectors, but it's all science and data proven, right? So it's showing you just the way that racial bias shows up. And it shows up all over the place all the time. So one thing is just, challenge yourself to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And then I think the other thing too is, as a leader in this space, I have to understand that I have a certain level of white privilege that gets me in front of people that my other colleagues and my other teammates otherwise maybe wouldn't be able to be in front of. And so I use that as an opportunity to both make people more aware of structural racism and white supremacy, but also be able to leverage those resources. Things aren't going to change until money changes hands also too. So that's one thing that I would also say as well. And then I think the third thing is that more and more it's a recognition of when being able to be self-reflective and think like, when is my voice necessary? And when is it actually a choice, a better leadership choice, to have somebody else take the lead? And then the final thing I'll say is that food always helps. So have a dinner, have a Shabbat dinner, invite people over, open your doors, right? Like that is just the way to cultivate and build community. So just don't hesitate to use that resource.
That's right. Over here, this side of the room. Yes.
All right. Excuse me for being slightly contrarian in asking this question, but I agree with you how important the use of language is, and using humanizing language. We have to sell. This has to be sold to our boards and so forth before the community will act on it. And a couple of the language suggestions I've heard strike me as things that will turn off the Jewish community rather than turning it on. And the two of those are, first, you've got a community with lots of lawyers, and lawyers who only hear intercepted and don't hear conviction ever mentioned. I think for those who have spent a lot of time being concerned about due process and realize it isn't perfect, also realize it isn't totally imperfect. And so I think I'm concerned about that. Secondly, even more concerned, I think to compare mass incarceration to anything relating to the Holocaust is an immediate turnoff in the Jewish community, because the Holocaust is seen as such a unique event that you're not going to be able to talk past that. So
I just want to actually jump in right there. They're not comparing the Holocaust and slavery, they're comparing the traumatic effects of both of those on our community that are passed down from generation to generation, and that being a place of commonality between.
I understand that,
communities
but
of color.
you won't get. I don't think you'll get past the word Holocaust to be able to explain those subtleties.
I respect that.
That's my contrary.
I know, I respect that, because I believe that you make a valid point. There are certain terms that are red flags, right? That to certain communities that bring forth a lot of like feelings. But as Jordyn mentioned earlier, sometimes people have to be uncomfortable at where they're sitting at, right? To engage these conversations. In order for us to get to the place where we're talking about healing and restoring, we have to deal with the traumatic experience that happened. We can't like just brush it under the rug. And I think that this is one of the tremendous disservices with communities of color, right? Like the older generation is not educating the younger generation on slavery. It's one of those things where like our parents say, oh, forget about it, slave what? Oh, go to work, go find a job. Like we really like disregard and neglect our like education and history. And this is one of the biggest things I respect about the Jewish community, because the Jewish community will never let their offspring forget about the Holocaust. Whereas communities of color, a lot of times we will like get into the place where we look at it as a crutch to mention slavery and not really educate our community to say, listen, this was real, this continued to happen, and this is how it's impacting you today. So thank you for that. Yes. Yes.
So another barrier besides race and privilege is also religion. So I joined an interfaith reentry coalition in Silicon Valley and was very interested in helping work on this work. And they did a lot of good work, but I was sort of the token Jewish organization, and everybody else came out of a Christian organization. And there was this sort of common belief that Jesus preached forgiveness, and I was like outside of that knowledge of forgiveness and that mindset. And so like when the Jewish community wanted to offer a class on parenting, we were asked, well, is this a Christian class that you're offering? Is this Christian values? And so to the extent that this national campaign can help lift up a common religious value system that people are really not very aware of, I think, in certain places, I think that would be also helpful.
Some of us were involved with the mental health community in Miami, in particular, with young adults or children with mental health issues. We intersect sometimes with the criminal justice system, and I think the Jewish community, we should realize a large number of those who are incarcerated have either disabilities or mental health issues, something like 35–40%. And we have overwhelmingly large numbers of Jewish psychiatrists or people in the healthcare industry or parents. So we can mobilize on that whole issue of pushing for more psychiatric beds, more community services, more training of the police to handle a situation where, where a person is acting out on a mental health issue and ends up dead.
Yes, thank you for that. And yes, there are roughly 40% of people that are of the 9,000 to 10,000 people who are on Rikers Island are diagnosed with a mental illness, and that's diagnosed. Remember, there's a percentage that is undiagnosed. So we always have to keep in mind when it comes to numbers, that the numbers aren't always accurate. The numbers are always higher than actually what is presented. Yes.
I'm so moved by your presentations, but I'd like to bring it to the arena of public policy. And so many people of color who have been incarcerated coming back into the community. They're in Rhode Island, because we're a small state, we've been able to work together to try to get some bills passed to help people come back in society and get affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd love to see, and it's so wonderful to welcome you here, Roy, and certainly have both of you here telling us, where do we also can together begin to help them integrate back into society? And where does that fit in with what we're doing here?
So reentry or mass incarceration, criminal justice reform, whatever you want to, like, whatever the term you use, look at it as a humongous beast, right? And everyone, every JCRC, every other nonprofit that's doing this work is taking a hold of this beast and is pulling. We all have a place on this beast where we can put our hand and pull. And that's how we should be looking at mass incarceration, right? We can't look at it from a perspective just like bail or just sentencing. We have to look at it from a lot of different, we have to look at school to prison pipeline. We have to look at, like, why are prison beds being built or based off of the scores of third graders? Like, there's so many different elements to mass incarceration. It's all about, like, what's in your state, what's the policy that's being pushed currently, like what are some of the policy and the elected officials, find out what your elected officials, what are they supporting, what are the bills they're writing, because I always like to tell people, we don't put enough emphasis on these local elections, city councils, assemblymen. We only put, like, emphasis on mayors, governors, and presidential elections, and we need to focus more on the local elected officials because they impact our everyday living. And a lot of them, you need to find out what their interests are when it comes to mass incarceration, when it comes to criminal justice reform. So as far as reentry, I always like to say the single most important thing, in my opinion, you can offer to any man, woman, or child that's coming home from jail or for prison is stable housing. The single most important thing. You can offer them the best job in the world, but if they don't have nowhere to rest their head at night, they're probably not going to keep that job for a very long time. So stable housing, which also provides, obviously, meals inside the house, so it's not an empty refrigerator, is one of the single most important things you can offer to a person. So there are a lot of different, we could talk more about that offline. Yes?
Because it's kind of weighing on me, the comment that this gentleman made here around how do you make this, and I apologize for circling back to that, but it's just in terms of, how do you engage, like, prosecutors, right? And, like, selling this idea around getting a conviction. And so someone who deals with district attorneys and prosecutors often, because of the program that we have in our organization, Common Justice, one of the things we engage prosecutors about, we know that there's this idea of holding people accountable. And we know that you want to have these convictions. But what power do you give the person that was actually harmed in that experience? And so what we found is that oftentimes the people that were harmed themselves are not even a part of that process necessarily. And it's taken out of their control. And so the prosecutors, the district attorney's office, are oftentimes, like, leading the whole charge of what happens to the person that was responsible for causing the harm. And so the harm party themselves are like, okay, they trust fully in that, but they don't even heal from that, right? The trauma that they experience, right? Because it's taken out of their control, the system convicts or they prosecute, and this person who was harmed is just left with their trauma, unaddressed, unhealed. And so what we say is that, well, we understand the need to convict people if that's the case. But how are you looking at the person who's ultimately been harmed, and what say do they have in the matter? And what do they want to see as a conviction or not? And that's where we kind of operate from and engaging people around that conversation. Do we get a lot of pushback? Of course we do. Because we know that that's their job and their responsibility to so-called keep the public safe. But how safe are you keeping people if they still have unaddressed harm, unaddressed trauma, right? And they aren't safe themselves because they're still afraid that something may happen to them. So I just wanted to kind of respond to that because it was important, just to kind of know it's a challenge, right? And having that conversation around, you know, how do you deal with this issue with convictions,
What's
right?
the percentage of people who would, like the harmed population?
So in common justice, those who are harmed, 90% of the people who are harmed say they would prefer for them to be in common justice rather than to go to prison. That's the other thing that we put forth before prosecutors and district attorneys. 90% of the people who are harmed, so we don't want them to go to jail. Do they want to like kill them if they could at one point in time? They want to like cut them up or beat them up? Of course they have all those thoughts. But in the end, after they process all of that, they say, well, jail is not going to really do anything for them necessarily, much less for me. So if there's a program that can hold them in a way that can cause them to repent in some way using language in religious ways, or to like restore the harm that they've done by doing things to make it as right as possible. So with common justice, there's agreements that are formed in this restorative circle that we have with the harmed party and responsible party. And the harmed party can say, well, I want you to go to school. I want you to write a letter to my child, right, who you almost killed. I want you to say to your daughter that what you did was wrong, right? Those things are far more challenging and more accountability based than put somebody in jail, in a cell, and keep them there for 10 years, and the resources are not that supportive in a way to change people's thinking so they come out and do the same thing again. So I just kind of wanted to touch that a little bit. It may not have responded fully to your thought, but in terms of that's how we engage like prosecutors and DAs who are more concerned about convictions rather than healing people in some way.
So I'm about to be the bearer of bad news. Okay, ask me a question. Ask a quick question, really a quick answer.
One really quick. In regards to the forgiveness, I think another way of thinking about it from a Jewish perspective is justice. Mm-hmm. You know, in terms of finding that balance between the person who's been harmed, and the victim, and the person who's hurt them. And then the other, and I won't ask my second question because it's a longer question, so I'll ask you for a second afterwards.
I'll ask for a second. And in certain faiths, whether it's I guess in Islam or Christianity, you know, this is the idea like you go straight to God, right? But I know from the Jewish perspective, right, you have to do something, right, to make things as right as possible, which is unique, right? Because, you know, to make things as right as possible for the harm that you caused is powerful. It's transformative for the person that was harmed and the person that caused the harm. And this is the model that I would maintain and venture to say should be lifted up in the criminal justice system. If you had that model, right, we would almost eliminate the incarcerated population probably overnight, right? And then people could heal in different ways because you get to the generational trauma, you get to all of these things to help people understand each other differently than what's being portrayed oftentimes.
So I'm not being red flagged, so I'll ask one or two other questions.
It's only because you're white.
I know I'm being red flagged.
Maybe the hairy
It's because of your hair. You have privilege.
And so many things, but I just want to quickly touch on them really, really quickly. So, Roy, you said something interesting, which was that one of the things, I think, paraphrasing, you appreciate about the Jewish community is that we remind our children of the Holocaust. I would take us back thousands of years. We remind them that we were slaves. Mm-hmm. And so I actually asked a Christian minister once why the African American community doesn't do that. His response, which was one person's, was, it's too soon, it's too painful. Which is just, I only put it there, but I just want to flag that it's not just the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. It's every year, once a year, we go back and talk about being slaves. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. The other thing is the point that this gentleman made about the Holocaust not being a starting point, and I think you were starting to talk about, or you did talk about that, Andre, is I would say competing victimization doesn't do anybody any good. So let's talk about trauma, because that's the common point. It doesn't matter. It's trauma. Because we can talk about pogroms, we can talk about being slaves in Egypt, we can talk about African American slavery. It's trauma. Yep. Done. It's science. It's DNA. Done. So let's not compete on that. And then the last thing I wanted to say to you, Roy, was you talked about local elections. I'd take us also school board elections. Those are really critical because we got a school-to-prison pipeline, and if we don't have the people of color representing on those school boards, and those people transition to local politics as well, we're not doing any service to our kids. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, the challenge is sometimes, and especially in the black community, when it comes to school boards, it's not to suggest that black folk aren't interested in those things, but black folk have been an uninformed constituency for many, many years, and it's obviously systemic. It's connected to institutional racism. It's connected to the enslavement of black people in the Americas, in the West Indies, and continental and diasporic Africa. And so folk in the black community, right, obviously are more concerned sometimes with survival, right, than being able to sit down at a local school board, to sit down and to understand politics, when a lot of times elected officials have not been representing the best interests of the black community or communities of color. So I hear that a lot of times, but why don't black folk get involved, right? And that's not to suggest overwhelmingly black folk don't, because you do have a group or a class of black folk that get involved. But the overwhelming majority of black folk in this country who suffer at the hands of oppression in this country and racism are not concerned with those things, right? Because they feel that the system itself is fundamentally and fatally flawed and has failed them. So they don't want to get involved in that kind of stuff, right? Even though they should. But they don't have time, right? Because they feel, I got to survive. I got to feed my children. I got to worry where this money is going to come from, etc. And so what's important for the black community, I think, is to organize our folk by helping them to understand the value and power in organizing to engage those different spaces around politics, around administrative school engagements, etc. So I agree with your point, but I just want to give some background on like why black folk don't have the time to get involved with that kind of stuff, right? Because they're just, again, you become so dissatisfied at some point where you just say, you know what, I'm done. You ever dealt with that person that you tired of them, you sick of them bothering, you just don't want to deal with them any longer? And at some point, I've engaged you long enough, I'm just sick of you. I don't even talk to you. I don't even deal with you anymore. And that's kind of how a lot of times black folk have engaged those spaces around politics, etc. Just sick of it.
Yes. With that said, to speak to the pastor and what he said, as far as with the racism, with the slavery thing, as far as too soon. Slavery is now for a lot of people of color, mostly all. Mass incarceration is the manifestation of what traditional slavery was. It never stopped. So we first have to understand that, you know, we had what you call convict leasing back in the earlier times, 60s and 70s. You had, you know, the person that founded Rikers Island, who was a slave catcher, Richard Riker. And now it's like the largest holding jail in the country. You have the 13th Amendment. So we have things that are in law that are going to keep people, as long as they break the law, of a slave. So we have to understand that slavery did not come and go. It's an ongoing thing that is manifested into a new monster. The next monster is not going to be in the cells. It's going to be ankle bracelets and wrist bracelets. So now it's going to be community incarceration. So now what's going to happen is, through the gentrification, is you're going to keep people of color in impoverished communities, and poor whites as well, and Latinos, isolated in their own community. And if you pay attention to gentrification, if you live in the Northeast, you know most people of color are now moving what? South. It's getting back to how it used to be. And we have to identify and realize that this is real. Gentrification is real. Brooklyn is the most gentrified place on the planet, by the way, in case y'all don't know. Brooklyn, New York, the same Brooklyn, New York, which was, as you know, a bad place. But now Brooklyn is like the most expensive place to live in the United States, which makes no sense to me at all. So we have to understand that and process that. I want you to give a hand to my two fellow panelists. Jordyn wants to drop
One thing I want to say about that is just overarching thing that I've been thinking about is just the way that money works in all of this.
Yeah.
Like the capitalization and the privatization around this, and also how that affects politics. So just as individuals, remember your right to vote, remember it's powerful, remember your right to purchase things, remember that's powerful. That to me is something that when you start to organize around, you need to think about.
Spending power. So, a hand one more time. Thank you. Feel free to come speak to them, and I'll be here for the next 2, 3 days, 4 days, I think, or something. I'll be around.